This podcast is brought to you by PLI, the Practicing Law Institute, committed to providing essential legal resources to the law school community. For more information, visit pli.edu/law school.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anastasia Boyko, and I am the host of PLI's How to Navigate Law School podcast. How to Navigate Law School is your podcast guide to unlocking the hidden knowledge and practical skills needed to succeed in law school. We connect students with valuable insights from experienced professionals, decompress law school's unwritten rules, and create a supportive community empowering students to confidently create their future. Hello and welcome to PLI's How to Navigate Law School. My name is Anastasia Boyko, and today I am joined by Marta Ricardo. Marta is the Assistant Dean for Professionalism and Director of Lawyering Skills at Fordham Law School. Previously, she led career services at Columbia Law School, and she had a career both in law practice as well as in finance. And so welcome, Marta. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to have our conversation this morning about how to choose your right practice, right?
Yeah. And a lot of what we're trying to do with our podcast here is to give students some of these just nuts and bolts of things that I know that you and I have both talked about we wish we had in law school. And today we're going to talk about, how do you navigate your career, right? How do you choose a practice area? I think students have some semblance of what lawyers do before they come to law school, and then they're offered all of these options of different kinds of practice areas and what to do after law school. So let's get started. Big picture. Sure. How do you start thinking about that?
Yeah, big picture. So I have, over the years, I started off at a law school as an academic counselor. So some part of choosing a law practice thinks about the building blocks of an academic schedule of courses, but also I was thinking about, what I'm going to say today. And I say, be very curious your first year of law school. You have this sort of set list of classes, and it's shockingly similar at almost every school in the country. Almost every school in the country, you're taking those bar courses, the, contracts, torts, civ pro in the fall. I mean, it's amazing how much law education has not changed. And Anastasia and I have had a lot of conversations about how law practice could improve, adopt tech, I would say, a more client focus, a range of things. But that's not what we have. And I don't see that changing, unfortunately, in any way in the next maybe 10 years. So this will be good for 10 years. What I would say is, most law schools bring an extraordinary number of panel speakers to campus when you're a first year. Take advantage of those, listen in, think what sparks your curiosity. And also, you may have come to law school with a specific purpose in mind, either serving a specific client population. I am also a huge advocate for taking a couple years off and working before law school. That's one of the biggest regrets of my K through JD life. I was really young when I started law school, and really, I would say, not ready for law school myself. If I had to look back and talk to my 21-year-old self, I would say, please take some years off, explore who you are as a person. I might have made a different choice. But beyond just trying to talk to or listen to as many people as you can in your first year as you begin to explore. It's almost the other shame in law school now is how quick the recruiting process happens. Even in your first year, I remember we used to try and have students hold off till October to come and talk to us in career services. That would be almost malpractice now, right? Students are starting their 2L job search before they start their 1L job search these days. So what I would say is when you're thinking about your 1L job, I would think about it. And I would actually heavily lean into possibly doing some sort of public service or government service your 1L year if you can, or even if you really have no idea what you want to do, go and work as a judicial intern, right? That's one way to start to see what court cases look like. The other thing is there's this whole area of transactional regulatory and counseling practices that are kind of hidden in the first year of law school, unless you take a legislation and regulation course. So even if that course is an option for you as a 1L elective, I would actually advocate for that. So much of day-to-day law practice is dealing with administrative agencies, either at the state or federal level. I know, Anastasia, you started as a tax lawyer. Tax is administrative, right? It's a heavily administrative practice. It's also a heavily counseling practice, right? And the most sophisticated tax practice is around things we don't even have rules about, right? It's just like, what's the vibe, right? It's a little bit of what's the vibe practice. So I would say the more education, you have to sort of build up sort of thinking about like even what the opportunities are, right? Because I think most students, unless they come from families of lawyers, don't really even understand what the breadth of the practices are. And then after you kind of think about that, think about like what you want to do your 1L summer is almost an experiment. It could also be an experiment against leaning into what you won't like, right? Maybe. Sometimes people end up, we have a faculty member at Fordham who worked at the Manhattan DA's office and went there and really didn't like it, right? So that told her, like, I don't want to do prosecution work. That's sort of like almost like in most parts of the country, something a lot of lawyers do, right? A lot of people start their career states attorneys or prosecutors. But that's just sort of as I think about it, think about what it is what you don't know and what you need to learn more about. And then from that perspective, maybe be a little experimental your first year. If you have a dream, maybe shoot your dream. Often the first year is either unpaid or low paid. A lot of schools have some supplemental funding for public interest work. So that's an opportunity to get back a bit of your tuition money, because in most cases that's funded out of your tuition money. So think about it that way. Try and do that. And then as you begin your second year recruiting, which is like basically after one semester of grades, I think it's really helpful. And I assume PLI has a lot of resources, right, about what different practices are. And I would say listen to the rest of Anastasia's episodes, because I'm sure she's going to talk to lawyers. There are also a range of podcasts, and I'm going to forget the gentleman at Georgetown. You know who I'm talking about, Anastasia.
I think so.
Yeah.
We'll find it.
We'll find it and put it in the show notes. There's a podcast that goes over like, how do I lawyer podcast? And essentially, listen to the episodes that speak to you, even on 2x speed. And if you want to stack good habits, do it when you're walking around, right? If you're on your commute, if you commute driving or going on the subway or however you get to law school, there are times to do the How Do I Lawyer podcast. You could even listen to those before law school if you wanted to, just whatever piques your curiosity. While you exercise, you could listen to those podcasts. And then, I think the other thing you have to think about is always, you're going to take your set courses. You're going to do something your 1L year. For better or for worse, you're going to get a job. Assume you get a job. And my path was a little bit I did recruiting normally, and I had the opportunity my 1L summer to work in Miami, which is my hometown. And I worked at a medium-sized firm, which at the time was 40 lawyers. That was a medium-sized firm. And I did get to do some bank regulatory work. And I had this interest I had been in economics at I'd taken energy regulation course in undergrad, the economics of utilities course, which seems boring, but, a lot of law work is dealing with industries that are heavily regulated and a little boring. So my passion for talking about that, I think, got me some opportunities to work at large firms. And they were like, well, if she likes boring energy regulation, she could do any of these other boring things. So we have insurance, another great practice, which is an enormous part of law practice. So that I told the story about that. And I definitely leaned heavily into my personal narrative, right? My father is a Cuban immigrant and my mother is from the Midwest. So my joke was like, I grew up and I love Lucy. Imagine that Lucy and Ricky had a daughter. Well, that's me. And, for most of the partners I was interviewing with, that resonated. So I would say, you're building up your competencies and skills. You come to law school with skill, right? Don't forget what you come to law school with. You're building a new skill. And I actually think the first year of law school builds up a skill. And in some ways, you're degrading your regular human skills in some way, which is don't lose your human skill. That's my big advice. Because to be fair, in law practice, you need both. You need that analytical, breaking down, facts, reading cases, analogizing your situation to case law. That is critically important. And I would say, I was not anyone's law genius my first year, and certainly not my first semester. My first semester, I was just excited to be in New York City. And I would say I could have leaned in more to actually engaging with the intellectual community of the law school. My second semester, I got very lucky and was in a study group with the woman who turned out to be the number one person in my class. had no idea. She was just someone who was very nice. And I ended up in a study group with her. And I would say everything I learned my second year of law school was because I was in a study group with her and two other very lovely people in my class. And I learned from her, like how to talk about the law, how to think about the policy issues. And then the revelation opened and I did much better. Thank goodness, knock on wood, right? For the help of good friends. Better enough that I had a story about how I did better, and better enough that I was able to have, some good opportunities. And I also looked very broadly. Like I also looked at like what at the time were firms with like 100 lawyers in New York City, which was very unusual. People didn't do that. They only went for the biggest, largest law firms. But I was like, well, I don't know what I want. I'll be open-minded. And I also maybe don't pay that much attention to what other people are doing. So I just did what I thought was right for me. And that's another, I think, huge lesson. Do what's right for you. Comparison is the thief of joy. One of my students said that this past fall in a class, and he's 100% correct that it is, right? So to really resonate with, like, in terms of practice, let me just make sure I think about this the right way. Think about your skills. Think about if you have a drive and a motivation of what took you to law school, don't lose sight of that, right? If you came to law school to reform the criminal justice system, hang true to that, right?
Yeah.
Lean into that in any way that you can, whether that be volunteering, whether that be, at Columbia, they did this fabulous program where they had collected books to take to Rikers Island, right? So they leaned into serving a population with, a population they cared about with education. They have other, post-incarceration clinics and other things that they do there. But think about, and at Fordham, we have an enormous amount of immigration service, right? So the Feerick Center for Social Justice is named after one of our former deans and is very active in taking students to the border. And more now than ever, we need a lot of legal services in this country, and we're going to need a huge effort to do that. But law school is a time to do that. Even if you're going to pivot and have a very corporate practice, you still can have another part of your life, right? Law is not just one thing. Right? Most people should think about law school and having you're learning how to learn. You're always going to learn. New laws are always going to come. And you have to think about how to train your brain to learn new things. So that's what I would say is the huge benefit of law school. And I think I know, Anastasia, you're an enormous advocate of that, right?
Yeah.
And
I think that framing that you gave is so useful, right? In the sense that we come into law school, we learn quickly, right, that we need to sort of make a choice, or at least there's this sort of communal pressure to start making choices. The pedagogical model hasn't changed much. I love these notes around iterating, especially trying out different things. Like I too was K through JD. And I think I had a sense of what I wanted to do. And I thought I was going to be a big time litigator and a big firm. I got to my first semester and I didn't like the work of litigation. Yeah. And so then I had to sort of pivot and change everything. And so I think two things are happening at once, right? Like we're in law school, we're taking courses, we're getting curious, we're learning. And then simultaneously, there's this very serious pressure to figure out what you're going to do after law school. And to your point, the recruiting timeline has shifted considerably sooner, right? And so one of the things that I know we've talked about is sort of like figuring out who you are. And so do you have sort of tips on resources that students can do maybe even before law school or at the very beginning of 1L year to sort of figure out who they are and what kind of practice might be a good fit for them in the context of who they are?
Yeah. That is, so you could do an MBTI, like you could do the standard sort of Myers-Briggs test. And I'm trying to think about I'll think of some other diagnostic.
I like StrengthsFinder too.
Yeah, I think StrengthsFinder is useful. Most schools have some career counselor who's licensed in that, right? That has done the StrengthsFinder test. I have done StrengthsFinder.
Me too.
And it turned out I did it as part of a team exercise. And I did it too late in life, right? I did StrengthsFinder when I was like in my 40s. That's ridiculous, right? You should definitely do it. And I actually think you change as a person as your brain develops. And I'm a huge believer that your brain is not fully developed till you're about 25 years old. Yet another reason why I shouldn't have gone straight through to law school. Because certainly my judgment and my patience for other people was not at their height when I was 22. Absolutely not. And that you don't know what you don't know. But I would say after doing StrengthsFinder, MBTI, the other thing you have to think about is like litigation practice. And I often say this to students at the beginning, it's research and writing at the very beginning for the first 4 or 5 years. It's like you're taking a piece of a large puzzle in litigation and you are the research expert possibly in the topic. You spend a lot of time alone and a lot of time in thought with yourself. You be part of a team, but you have like a team meeting. You might be in charge of some piece of discovery, and then that piece leads to like go read the case law on this. But you spend an enormous amount of time alone and with books and a deep analysis. And my husband was a litigator for many years, and he will sit in his office and read cases. And you never stop reading cases. That's the other thing. If you think becoming a partner in a law firm, no, absolutely not. Every partner in a law firm has a giant binder of every case for an oral argument, and it's sitting there, and they have read every case. There's no way that they haven't read every single case and can distinguish one from the other as if they're ready for the hot bench of the appellate argument. But absolutely, there's no way you're going to stop reading cases. So think about that, right? It's never like that you're going to be sitting up in the front of the courtroom just pontificating. No way, right? You are going to be so steeped in the case and so steeped in the facts and the law that you're the expert of the whole case. And for some people, that's thrilling, right? Like they love the analysis of antitrust law, right? They love the economic analysis. They like to make arguments about market size, whatever it is that they're compelled to do. But that's the life, right? And it's not that it's necessarily, and there's also a lot of, how shall I say, my husband did a lot of letter writing back and forth, like to memorialize our conversation. Please note, right? Like this, like sort of markers along the way. There's a lot of that in practice. Corporate practice, which is what I did. I was a capital, regular capital markets writing prospectus lawyer. It is more teamwork. There were times where my job over the weekend was to write a whole prospectus. That's not easy, but there were bigger team elements to it. And there were lots of times I sat in on conference calls for a day with a partner and a more senior lawyer where we all just sat there and were on a telephone, right? It was pre-Zoom land. Pre-teleconference land, we just to sit in the partner's office for hours on phone calls arguing about different covenants and representations and warranties and contracts, or what would be in a prospectus, or on the phone with our client for hours. That's what we would do. And then at night, we would write everything, right? That used to be the life of a corporate lawyer. Now, I think the life of a corporate lawyer now is probably a little different. And there are resources like Practical Law with all sorts of forms and other things. Forms, when I was a young lawyer, was like stacks of prospectuses in some partner's office, and they would throw things at me, and I'd have like a stack of 10 prospectuses, and they're like, just look at this provision in 10 of them. And I'd open them all up at my desk and kind of type like little snippets from each one. That's a very different practice. So there is a big writing component to corporate practice, and certainly you have to think through how all the provisions work together. You have to be, I would say, not that I love this, but you have to be a little perfectionist. That's the reason why perfectionists go to law school, right? You have to kind of, there are people paying attention to every period and every space. And I was the copy editor of my high school newspaper. So maybe that skill helped me be careful. You also have to know how to check your own work, right? So you do your work, but then you have to go back and you have to check your own work to make sure it's correct before you give it to someone. So I would say that doesn't sound so exciting, but for some people, they like that, right? Some people enjoy, that's a way to lean into your anxiety, right?
And it's a combination, right? It's a combination of like skills, right? And sometimes you have to evaluate, like, are those things that I want to keep doing, right? Really, have I honed some things that might actually not necessarily bring me fulfillment, right? And there's a constant conversation, I think, in the working career pathing world of like, do you choose your talent? Do you choose your skills? Do you choose your passion? And I think it's a combination of those things, right? It's how do I pull those things together and decide what should lead? And at the beginning of your career, especially as a lawyer, you're just feeling this out. And so I think to your point, having conversations with lawyers as well, right? And getting a sense from them about what they do day to day. Like, that's why I love having folks like you on, like you to walk us through your career, right? Like, how did you make choices? And every individual made individual choices for themselves based on the circumstances that they were in at that time. And I would also say, like, we have ChatGPT now. So you can very much look up what a certain kind of practice area looks like before you have a conversation with someone. And so would you mind talking a little bit about like how can you use the alumni network to be able to do some of this informational research and digging?
So when I first started working in the law school, I was in the academic advising area, and then the financial crisis happened and we realized we needed a resource in the alumni career services area. So they created a new type of position, and I was the first person in that role. And I am, maybe you can tell from this, not shy. So I got on LinkedIn. I have been on LinkedIn quite a while now, and I have I think over 5 or maybe almost 6,000 connections now. And the funny thing is I actually know all those people, and I'm really good at keeping in touch with it. I think I'm good at keeping in touch with people.
You are?
And I have said to students that they should think about, if they see someone they really admire in their career path, they shouldn't be afraid to sort of reach out to them. One, they may come to campus, right? So if they're at campus, go to the event. Absolutely. And then you get the chance at the end of the panel to kind of hang out, come to the front of the room, ask a specific question, tell the person about yourself, say why you admire them. And then then you can also kind of look back on their career and say, oh, well, it looks like they did an externship at the NBA Players Association. Maybe I should do that, right? If I'm in the city where that exists. Or, maybe I should, or the person may say to you, and I say this often to students, please do not do what I did, because I did structured finance, and that doesn't even exist anymore, right? Even when I was an investment banker, I used to say to the young investment bankers, if you have the opportunity to do a different area in the bank, please do that, right? Because the area I did was quite narrow, I would say. It's very idiosyncratically its own thing. And I would say do something more general, like be in just a coverage group, right? If you're going to be a banker, which just means an industry group, right? You have a more flexible career. But that's one way to use the alumni network, actually just going to talk to the alumni in person. And the person who put that program together will be happy there's a full audience if everyone listens to me. The other thing you can do is, LinkedIn is a great platform. If you're a student, you can always say to an alum, connecting with you is the title of the email. I have played with titles of emails to reach out to people who you would not think would write back to me. And now I will say, I don't want to jinx myself, I'm 100% returner of email. I have figured out how to do it. Now I'm doing it on behalf of someone else. It's not for me. I never do it for me. And I'm always doing it for someone else. But I'm pretty good at crafting an email that will get someone to respond to me. And I will say something really interesting about the student I want to connect the person with that will be oh, that's compelling. I'll talk to that person, right? It may be that the student is a veteran. It may be that the student, his family is from a family of immigrants. Whatever it is that I think will ally the person. I also think one of my superpowers is looking at someone's going to interview with someone else, and I can say to the student, I think this part about you is going to be interesting to them. Talk about that. I think I'm pretty good at figuring out what is the commonality between people, even when the people seem different. Maybe that someone did mission work. It may be, whatever it is, it will be easy enough, right?
It's the human part.
It's the human part.
It's the human part is what,
right.
Yeah, it's not that interesting. It's interesting to ask somebody, especially, when we talk about interview prep and you're going through OCI, it's important to ask about their practice areas to understand what they do day to day. But I think we connect and we build relationships based on our shared human experiences and not necessarily our shared work experiences, which are interesting, on their own. I don't think that's untrue, but I feel like finding people who you want to work with is the other big piece of it, right? Is you're going to have conversations with alumni. I did the same thing. We had a fairly small alumni pool when I was a student, but I reached out to everybody I could, especially people who are doing non-traditional things. That's the other thing is what practice areas right now. And there are so many interesting practice areas and practice areas that never existed before, right? There are now lawyers who are focusing on AI, right? There are lawyers who have been doing cannabis regulation. There are lawyers who do cybersecurity. They're just topics that hadn't been in law school when we were in law school that are now becoming really robust practice areas. And so being open to all of those, but also realizing that careers are long and you may want to pivot into in-house practice, which looks completely different. You may want to go do something on the policy side within a company. There's so many things you can do with your career. And I don't want students to get overwhelmed by that. I want them to feel excited about the possibilities and realize that if you choose one thing first and you may not like it, you can pivot. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about how areas vary depending on the firm, the office, the team that you might be with, right? Because boutique litigation practice looks different than big firm litigation practice, and corporate work can look different on the big company M&A side versus the ECVC side. So how should students think in context of practice areas?
So the other thing, look at who the clients of the institution are, right? So if you look at the client, it matters a lot. It matters for sometimes I meet students and they know they want to be an in-house lawyer. Let me pick a company. I don't know, at Amazon, right? That's what I said. Well, then you need to work at a firm that does work with Amazon, right? If that was as simple as that. And now I don't. Or, I would say, so you want to look at what industries they're serving. So that makes a difference in your day-to-day. But also, if you represent companies or underwriters as a securities lawyer, I didn't realize that made such a huge difference, but it makes a huge difference in who does the work. If you represent the company, you write the prospectus. If you represent the underwriter, you write nothing. You write the underwriting agreement, which is a form which doesn't change. That's easy. And the other thing is when I say to students, like if you represent companies, this is going to be like very idiosyncratic to my securities practice. If you represent investment grade, which just means companies that have a high credit rating, that is the easiest thing you could ever do in your life. You could do it with one eye shut. It's so easy. So I don't want to, what I would say is that work is hard to get, and I don't want to name firms that do that work, but I sometimes I speak with a student who's at a firm where I know they do some work that's not so time consuming, and I'm like, who's doing that work? Why don't you try and do that work? And they say to me, oh, this other person who seems to be the son of someone's general counsel is doing that. I'm like, well, they were smart. Right? They figured out a way to get paid.
My professor said, do ERISA. And it never made sense. Like, why would I do it? And then once I became a tax lawyer, I thought I should have done ERISA, right? Yeah. Always needed, highly specialized. Yes. Every firm needs an ERISA lawyer if they're doing corporate work.
So there's those idiosyncratic things within practices, but you can learn that when you're a summer associate, you can kind of figure out or you can even learn it before you start at the firm. We had a panel on Wednesday evening at Fordham where we had a lawyer who's a tax partner, actually, at Simpson Thacher, and she does both M&A and private equity tax work, but that's a lot of work, right? That's an enormous amount of work. It's you're a crucial person in that pin. You're creating the structures of all those transactions, but it's helpful to know, within the areas of what you think you might be interested in, the subsections, who are the typical clients, what does the day look like? That's another thing. We used to always do a panel where we would say, what's your typical day? How do you start your day? What do you read? That's a question you can always ask a lawyer. What are you on conference calls? How much time are you spending writing by yourself? How much time are you creating? I used to spend, to be fair, as a structured finance lawyer at the beginning of every transaction, we had a huge whiteboard where we'd write the transaction structure, and I'm going to date myself and write the waterfall. What is the order of priority of payments, right? Order of the priority of payments in the debt structure. Right. And also I did a lot of offshore structured finance. So will we run this company through the Caymans? What is the tax implications Brazil to Cayman? What are the tax implications Brazil to BVI? I mean, all sorts of interesting cross-border structuring issues, which I liked, right? I'm kind of a two-culture kid. Love it. Yeah. I love to be on the phone and talk with the local Mexican counsel. I learned just as much from our local counsel in Mexico and Brazil that I did from the partners I worked with, right? Because I would eventually end up being the only one on the phone with the Mexican counsel. Sadly, sometimes that's the junior job. And it wasn't because I spoke Spanish. It was just because sometimes it was the most junior job, or I volunteer, right? I'd volunteer to get on the phone, and then I would ask them all sorts of questions about local law. And I'm sure they were like, Marta, what are you doing? Why are you asking me these questions? I was interested in how would we enforce this? If we have this covenant, does this even make any sense, right? This is a civil jurisdiction. And Mexico has this right in Spanish called amparo, which is this ability to constitutionally challenge something that we don't have in the United States, like the right to be paid, which is kind of, if you're a bank, you want to get paid. Right. So you needed to understand and be able to write that and explain it to investors. So I leaned into my natural curiosity. So,
and that's a really good point, right? Yeah. Is that it's depending on where you work by client mix and size of firm, you're going to get different kinds of responsibilities, right? So sometimes I'll to students about, they want to choose firms that are super prestigious and really large and there are benefits to that as well. And I remind them that you may not get the same kind of clients as you might in a smaller firm or a boutique firm or that has a different client mix. And so it's really important, to your point, ask what does your day look like, and have those conversations with both senior and junior lawyer, because you may get super frustrated. I mean, and I'm sure you hear this all the time, students who start practice in a prestigious large firm and may not get the kinds of responsibility that they want. And then they feel really stifled during that time because they may have not had the same kind of exposure and impact that they may have had in law school working on different kinds of more kind of close kind of legal services.
I would say, I think if you say that you want responsibility and there's a piece you get a sense no one else wants to do, they will give it to you. The other thing I hear recently, and I guess I am a Gen Xer, and I was, the joke, right, is that, we did everything by ourselves. We had heat up, microwavable meals and a key to our house, right? And I did walk to and from, I got myself home from elementary school by myself, right? I would take a public bus to a library, right? And I would hang out in a public library. And then my mom would randomly come and be like, are you here? No cell phone. No one knew where you were. Love it. Love the life of being untethered. And so I do think there can be responsibility. I also think I always ask questions about how my piece fit into the bigger piece. Even if my piece was proofreading the numbers that the accountants gave me, I always asked, and I think, for the accounting numbers, how those fit into the prospectus. That was the worst job in the first deal that I worked on. The accountants, and then they realized I was actually very good with numbers and really good at adding everything up. And I found mistakes that the accountants made. And the partner was like, wow, no one finds mistakes with accountants. I said, oh, I'm really picky and I'm good at I just get my little calculator out. I would compare it. I would say, this changed. Why did this change? And the accountants were like, what is wrong with you? Why are you bothering us so much? And I was
but that's a good, you're underscoring something that I think is super important for students to understand is you need to be curious. People who you're working with don't know what you don't know, but they also know that you don't know a lot right now because you haven't practiced law. And so asking those questions of contextually, how does this fit together? And what is my piece in the larger scheme of things? Not only do you have investment in what you're working on, but very much shows that you're a naturally curious person to solve the bigger problem versus do this and then you go do it. It's not a very valuable skill set when you're a lawyer who needs to solve problems. And to solve problems, you need to be curious, even if your scope might be limited when you're first starting practice.
Absolutely. I would say the first deal that I worked on where I was counting up all these numbers was a sulfur mining company. Very exciting. You need, that product goes into other industrial products. So, it's sort of important, but it was very industrial. And there was lots of leases for bucket wheel excavators. I don't even know what that is, but I had to dictate my due diligence notes into a tape recorder and then edit them all as I came back. You do learn just by, I will say my first, and everyone will be able to know where I worked because they'll probably look at my LinkedIn or you'll link it. I worked at Milbank Tweed at the time, and I had the real great advantage of working with a lot of mid-level associates and senior associates who really were very perfectly happy to sit down at the little round table in their office and go through my markup and tell me you did this wrong, you did this right, you did this wrong, you did this right. And I would learn.
Feedback is a gift, right? And students say that all the time, right? When you first start as a lawyer, you just want to know whether you're on the right and well and what you can do better. And I think sometimes we can have our ego around that and worry about getting criticism back. But it's nice to know if you're going in the right direction. And so I want to be mindful of time. And one resource that I found to be super useful later on in my career that I wish I would have known existed earlier on is headhunters, right? Understand the legal industry in a way that nobody else has. And we were lucky at Yale to sometimes have one of our alums who's a headhunter come and talk to students to understand geography, firm size, how to differentiate among the firms when they all sound the same, how to think about practice areas. Do you have ideas about how students can leverage the knowledge that headhunters have, whether it's following other ways to get to download that high level information?
Yeah. Well, one, they know what practice area is, how shall I say, where there's demand, right? So I would say they know that market piece. And I'll be careful about what I say. And because when I was a young structured finance lawyer, that actually was a hot ticket practice. So I had 3 offers to be a lateral, all lined up at the same time when I left Milbank. And I managed to do that both through direct outreach to someone who had left the Milbank and gone to another firm. I just cold emailed people who left to be like, I might want to join you. And they were like, hot minute called me back. Okay. Okay. So that I did some things without headhunters. So if I mean, that's the obvious thing. If there's a part of your practice that picks up and goes to another firm, know that you obviously can go there, even if they don't know you. Yeah. Okay. They'll hire you in 2 minutes. And then the other thing I would say, so headhunters know what's in demand, but I would also say, understand the interests of headhunters to students. Correct. They are making money off of you. They don't not care about you. I think they want to sort of make sure that if you're in a bad situation where you're being taken advantage of, and what would I say is taking advantage of? No visibility to clients, just grinding away at the same thing, no progression, right? I had the great, again, maybe I was lucky. Maybe my summer class was a sort of post-recession, early 90s recession class. We were small. So actually, I do think that the firm was thoughtful even before professional development departments. We did not have a professional development department, but we were thoughtful about that. But if you aren't progressing, if you're just doing the same thing as a second year that you were doing as a first year, you need to either upskill within your firm or get out.
Yeah, and that's really important. That's really important, like the economics of it. I think it's hard, I think, for students to understand this because you're trying to wrap your head around all of the practice areas as concepts and what you want to be doing skill-wise. Yeah. But also realize that like you're in an economic time and there will be shifts both while you're in law school and by the time that you graduate. And so just be mindful of that, right? As you mentioned, like there are going to be waves as when those are coming to bear. I would also plug Lateral Hub as a resource.
Agreed.
I think we'll add some links to that about, understanding again, practice areas, what's in demand, things that students and summer associates might need to know. And so there are so many different ways to start to think about that. And to your point, yes, right? Like the economics of it definitely will impact as we make those decisions.
Right.
I have one more question for you as we wrap up, which is how I'm trying to wrap this up with all of our guests. And what kind of advice would you have for your former law school self? If you could give, 1 to 3 points to yourself, what would it be?
It would have been to take some time off. Right. It would have been to work. And I would say it would have been to take some years off. I don't know that it would have been to do a pre-legal type of thing. I was very interested. I was a political science major. I would have, and I graduated from college in 3 years, would not have done that. Right. I would have gotten a double major in econ. Right. Because that would have helped me in my finance career. I would have done that. I would have worked and I would have, possibly I should have done something like AmeriCorps, right? Or some service type of thing. I actually think being very focused on people and humans is very important. So making sure you lean into that. I maybe would have done a clinic. I never did a clinic. I probably would have done that. And then because I teach experiential courses, take as many experiential courses as you can, or take a good balance of experiential and doctrinal courses. I was very good at taking, I think, one of the building blocks of doctrinal courses. I took tax and corporate tax. I took antitrust. I took secured transactions, securities, corporations. I took like every 1-letter law school class, even though I was never going to clerk. I took legislation and regulation. That was a requirement. I even took a legal theory class. I mean, I did good at the building blocks classes. And when I look at my transcript, I'm like, I was good. I chose good things. I chose also a lot of election law. I did advanced kind of con law, which I think is important as a human and a citizen in this country. That was always of interest of mine. But I would say the only other piece of advice I don't think I would have chosen different firms to work at. And I had a lot of jobs. I switched around jobs a lot between like being a lawyer. Like I kept switching a little bit when I was young. I think I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. In fairness to me, sometimes people reached out and said, we wanted you to do this job. And I was flattered by that. I would say, I don't know. I actually am I don't want to say I'm pretty happy with the way my career turned out. And I made this sort of very strange pivot into finance which came from a client, right? A client called me up and said, please do come work with us, which is, and don't forget, like being aligned with your clients is important. Like understanding their businesses and their perspective and getting like really leaning into that will make you an excellent lawyer. Like that is what clients want. Leaning into
over and over. That's what I keep saying.
And it's also, I had, the team I went to work with at Chase Manhattan Bank once said to me when I was their lawyer, keep me out of jail. Okay. Yeah. Yes, I will do that. We will always do. I'm a Girl Scout and we will always do the right thing, right? We will always do the right thing. And I like having clients who want to do the right thing. And that's the other thing. Like, you want to, even in the corporate world, want to have clients who want to comply with the law, right? There's a reason why we have federal securities laws, as I say. Yeah. People cheat. That's they do. I worked on Wall Street. 100%. We need U.S. attorneys to enforce the securities laws and all of the laws we have. So.
Yeah. No, I love it. I'm so glad that you joined me for this conversation. I think you very much hit the high points of being true to yourself and being curious and also iterating through your career. And there is no right answer, right? We figure it out as we go. And I think there's often too much pressure that we put on ourselves in law school to predict the needs of our future self and the desires of our future self. And that's not possible because you're constantly changing. So we hopefully gave you students some guideposts as you're going along your journey, and we'll share some resources in the show notes. But know that careers are long and you can try a lot of things over that time and trust yourself and your intuition as you go along that journey. Thank you, Marta.
Thanks for listening to How to Navigate Law School, the podcast dedicated to guiding you through the hidden rules and practical skills essential for success in law school. For additional resources, visit PLI's Law School Hub at pli.edu/law school. Please note that the views and opinions expressed during this podcast represent those of the individuals being interviewed and not necessarily those of PLI. PLI is a nonprofit learning organization dedicated to keeping attorneys and other professionals at the forefront of knowledge and expertise.